The Bavarian Alps, draped in their December finery, seem to beckon those who dare to tread upon their icy paths. My name is Anneliese Braun, and I have spent my life cataloging folklore that dances precariously on the edge of truth and imagination. My current journey, however, feels different. There's a weight to the whispers about the choir, a gravity that pulls at my resolve and makes my scholarly detachment feel woefully insufficient. I arrived in the village of Oberschwan at the urging of Johann Fischer, a local historian who had uncovered fragments of a long-forgotten manuscript. His letter, penned in hurried scrawls, described a tragedy buried beneath layers of snow and silence, a choir of children lost to an avalanche one Christmas Eve, their songs now the haunting soundtrack to a decades-old mystery. The villagers, as I quickly discovered, spoke sparingly of the choir. They would nod politely when I pressed them, eyes darting to the peaks that loomed like specters above the town. Frau Keller, the innkeeper, let slip only a single line before retreating into her kitchen. Their songs are not for the living. It was Johann who guided me to the trailhead. His enthusiasm bordered on unnerving, his insistence that the truth lay just beyond the trees, carrying an edge of desperation. As we ascended, the air grew sharper, biting at my skin with every step. And then it began, the faint melody drifting through the frozen air, delicate and ethereal. It wasn't the sharp crackle of snow or the howling wind, but something far more deliberate. I halted, my breath escaping in uneven clouds as I strained to hear. It was a hymn, no doubt, but the language was unfamiliar, its cadence mesmerizing and alien. Johann turned to me, his expression triumphant. "You hear it, don't you? Proof that they're real." I nodded, though unease coiled tightly in my chest. The sound, beautiful as it was, did not feel welcoming. If anything, it seemed to grow closer with every step we took. We reached a ridge overlooking the valley below, and Johann motioned for me to stop. "This is where they were buried," he said, his voice subdued. He pointed to a hollow that lay blanketed in snow. The avalanche consumed them here, but their voices. His words trailed off as the melody swelled, no longer faint but loud and all-encompassing. It seemed to wrap around us, seeping into the bones of the mountains themselves. I could not tell where it originated, only that it was here everywhere, demanding our attention. "Anneliese," Johann whispered, his face pale, "do you see them?" I turned, scanning the valley, my heart pounding as the song reached its crescendo. For a fleeting moment, I thought I glimpsed movement, small, shadowy figures flitting between the trees, their outlines blurred as though the snow itself resisted their presence. But before I could speak, the singing ceased abruptly, leaving only the unrelenting silence of the mountains. And in that silence, a single, unmistakable truth took root in my mind: we were not alone. The silence that followed the song felt heavier than the snow beneath our feet. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Johann stood motionless beside me, his hand gripping the strap of his satchel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I broke the stillness with a whisper, careful not to disturb whatever invisible presence lingered. "You saw something, didn't you?" He nodded, his face pale against the backdrop of snow. "Children. They were watching us." The weight in my chest tightened. I had seen them too, or at least thought I had. Shadows that seemed to dance along the edges of my vision, dissolving the moment I tried to focus on them. "We shouldn't stay here," I said. "Let's go back to the inn. We can come back tomorrow when—" But Johann's attention was fixed on something ahead. He pointed to a cluster of pine trees just beyond the ridge. "There. Do you see it?" I squinted, the failing light of the afternoon casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. At first, I saw nothing, but then it emerged, a dark shape against the pristine white. It was a steeple, half-buried and weather-worn, its wooden cross tilted at an angle as though bowing to the weight of the snow. "A chapel?" I murmured. Johann didn't answer. He was already moving toward it, his boots crunching against the frost. Reluctantly, I followed, every step accompanied by a growing sense of foreboding. As we approached, the song began again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. The voices were clearer now, and there was something achingly pure about them, as though they belonged to children singing with all the innocence of youth. But beneath their melody, I felt an undertone, a strange discordance, like a second, unseen choir mimicking their song in a lower, more menacing register. "Johann, stop," I called, but he didn't respond. His pace quickened, as if drawn by an unseen force. The steeple rose higher as we descended into the hollow. Its structure came into view, a small chapel, its roof partially caved in, the wood blackened and splintered by decades of exposure to the elements. The snow here was undisturbed, pristine, as though no living thing had set foot near it in years. Johann reached the door and hesitated. "This wasn't on the maps," he said, his voice trembling with equal parts awe and dread. "No one ever mentioned a chapel." I wanted to tell him to leave it alone, to turn back while we still could, but before the words could leave my lips, he pushed the door open. The interior was dark, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and something sweeter, almost sickly. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing rows of rotting pews and an altar draped in tattered cloth. A single shaft of light from the broken roof illuminated the center of the room, where a large, ornate bell hung suspended by a frayed rope. And beneath the bell stood a figure. It was small, childlike, but its form was wrong. Its outline shimmered, as though it weren't entirely solid, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. When it turned to face us, I felt a jolt of cold terror. Its eyes were empty, voids that seemed to draw in the dim light around them. Johann stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "It's one of them," he choked out. The figure raised an arm and pointed directly at us. The hymn swelled to a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath us seemed to shift, the snow collapsing inward as though the earth itself was opening to swallow us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Johann's arm and pulling him toward the door. We burst out into the open air, the song pursuing us like an unrelenting tide. The once clear trail was gone, erased by the shifting snow, and the sky above had darkened to an ominous gray. We stumbled blindly, the voices growing louder, closer. And then I felt it, a hand, small and icy, gripping my wrist. I turned, expecting Johann, but there was no one there. Only the faint impression of tiny footprints in the snow, leading back toward the chapel. The air seemed thinner as we stumbled through the snow, the hymn trailing us like a shadow. My breath came in gasps, plumes of frost dissolving into the freezing dusk. Johann was just ahead, his movements frantic, as though he could outrun the weight of what we'd seen. "Wait!" I called, my voice barely carrying over the wind. But he didn't stop. His panic was infectious, and I found my own feet quickening, despite the nagging whisper of self-preservation that told me to slow, to think. Behind us, the song faltered. It didn't fade, it fractured, splintering into discordant tones that grated against the nerves. It was as if the mountain itself were singing in defiance of some ancient silence. "Johann!" I shouted again, louder this time. He paused, turning back toward me with a wild look in his eyes. His lips moved, but the wind snatched the words away before they could reach me. And then I heard it, the bell. It tolled once, its deep, resonant chime rolling across the slopes like a physical force. The snow beneath my boots trembled, a subtle vibration that sent a jolt of fear through me. Johann froze, his head snapping toward the direction of the sound. "It's coming from the chapel," he said, his voice hoarse. "That's impossible," I replied. The rope was frayed, it couldn't. But the bell tolled again, louder this time, and with it came a sound that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't the hymn anymore. It was laughter, children's laughter, bright and mirthful, yet horribly wrong. I reached Johann just as the ground beneath us groaned. A fissure split the snow a few feet away, jagged and dark, the earth opening in defiance of the frozen landscape. From the depths came a rush of air, warm and fetid, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing his arm. But Johann didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the fissure, his body rigid. "Do you see them?" he whispered. I followed his line of sight, my stomach twisting as I spotted what he was staring at. Shapes moved within the darkness, faint and indistinct, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. They were small, childlike, their movements jerky and unnatural. The bell tolled a third time, and with it came a gust of wind so strong it nearly knocked us off our feet. Snow swirled around us in a blinding storm, and the laughter grew louder, echoing from every direction. "We can't stay here," I yelled, shaking Johann. He blinked, as though waking from a trance, and nodded. We turned and ran, the snowstorm swallowing us whole. The world became a blur of white and gray, the landscape unrecognizable. The sound of the bell and the laughter followed us, growing fainter with each step, but never disappearing entirely. It felt like hours before we finally stumbled upon the lights of the village. The sight of the warm glow spilling from the inn's windows filled me with a relief so profound I nearly collapsed. Inside, the heat hit us like a wall, thawing the frost that clung to our clothes and skin. The innkeeper, a stout woman with sharp eyes, rushed toward us, her expression a mix of concern and annoyance. "What on earth were you two doing out there?" she demanded. "It's nearly nightfall." "We found a chapel," Johann said between gasps. "Up on the ridge." The innkeeper's face paled, and she crossed herself instinctively. "You didn't go near it, did you?" Her reaction sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "You know about it?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing around the room as though afraid of being overheard. The other patrons were busy with their meals, their laughter and conversation oblivious to the tension at our table. "It's been there for years," she said finally, her voice low. "No one speaks of it. No one goes near it. Not since." She trailed off, her eyes darting toward the frost-covered window. "Not since what?" Johann pressed. The innkeeper's gaze fixed on him, her expression grim. "Not since the children disappeared." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Before I could ask her to explain, the door to the inn creaked open. A cold gust swept in, and with it came the faint sound of the hymn, carried on the wind like a cruel joke. The hymn returned that night, threading through my dreams like an insidious melody. I woke in a cold sweat, the haunting notes still echoing in my ears, as though they had seeped through the very walls of the inn. Outside, the wind howled, carrying whispers of snow against the windows. Johann was already awake, sitting by the hearth, his face drawn and pale. "You heard it too," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound steady. He nodded, his hands gripping a steaming mug of tea as though it were his last tether to sanity. "It wasn't just in my head, was it?" Before I could answer, a loud knock on the door startled us both. The innkeeper's voice came from the other side, her tone urgent. "Come downstairs. Now." We dressed hastily and made our way to the common room. The innkeeper stood by the window, her usually stern demeanor replaced by something close to fear. "Look outside," she whispered. I hesitated before stepping closer to the frosted pane. The village square was cloaked in darkness, save for a faint, flickering glow coming from the ridge. It was the chapel. That light hasn't been seen in decades, she said, her voice barely audible. It only appears when they're restless. Who? Johann asked, his voice breaking slightly. She turned to us, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and terror. The children. The weight of her words pressed down on us like the heavy beams of the inn. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the ridge, an inexplicable urge to follow the light, to unravel the mystery that had ensnared this village for so long. I have to go back, I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Johann spun to face me, his expression incredulous. Are you mad? We barely made it back alive. But the innkeeper stepped forward, her gaze steady. If you go, you must take this. She handed me a lantern, its glass panels etched with faint symbols I didn't recognize. It said to keep the spirits at bay, for a time. She didn't wait for my response, turning away as though unwilling to witness what might come next. Johann's protests followed me as I stepped out into the night, but I didn't stop. The pull was too strong, the hymn too insistent. I knew he would follow, he always did. The snow was deeper now, each step a struggle as we made our way toward the ridge. The wind carried the faint strains of the song, growing louder as we approached. The glow from the chapel pulsed like a heartbeat, its light illuminating the skeletal remains of long-abandoned trees. We reached the chapel just as the bell tolled again. The sound was deafening up close, reverberating through my bones. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the same shadowy interior we had fled hours earlier. But now, the pews weren't empty. They were filled with children, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They turned in unison as we entered, their movements eerily fluid, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The hymn swelled, filling the space with a suffocating intensity. I felt my knees weaken, the lantern trembling in my grip. Beside me, Johann muttered something under his breath, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. The figure at the altar was no longer obscured. It was a woman, her features sharp and otherworldly, her eyes burning with the same unnatural glow as the children. She held a staff, its top adorned with a cracked bell that seemed to emit a faint hum. You came, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. My throat tightened as she stepped forward, the children following in perfect synchronization. What do you want? I managed to choke out. Her lips curved into a chilling smile. To sing, she said simply. To sing forever. She raised the staff, and the bell tolled once more. The children began to move, their steps slow and deliberate as they closed in around us. The children advanced, their movements unerringly synchronized. Each step they took sent chills down my spine, and their song grew louder, more penetrating. The melody wasn't beautiful anymore, it was dissonant, scraping against my mind like icy nails. Stay back. Johann shouted, his voice cracking. He reached for my arm, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the woman at the altar. She tilted her head, her smile widening. Why resist? The song is a gift, a timeless harmony that binds us together. I raised the lantern, desperate to do something, anything, to keep them at bay. The light flared, casting distorted shadows across the pews. For a moment, the children hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering like candles in a draught. Johann, I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely audible over the rising hymn. The lantern, it works. He fumbled for a moment, then lit a torch he'd tucked into his coat. The fire sputtered to life, casting a weak glow. The children recoiled slightly, their steps faltering. The woman snarled, her ethereal beauty twisting into something grotesque. You think light will save you? This place belongs to the shadows, to the song. You cannot escape. Suddenly, the pews began to shift and groan as if alive. The wood cracked and splintered, sending shards flying through the air. The children vanished into the darkness, their song replaced by a guttural moan that seemed to rise from the chapel's very foundation. "Run!" Johann yelled, grabbing my arm. We stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping us inside. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on us. The woman raised her staff again, and the bell at its tip emitted a low, resonant hum. The ground beneath us trembled, and the altar split open, revealing a gaping chasm that seemed to descend into endless darkness. From the abyss, more figures began to emerge. Not children this time, but adults, their faces twisted and hollow, their bodies draped in tattered remnants of festive clothing. Their mouths opened in a silent scream, yet the hymn continued, louder and more chaotic than before. I clutched the lantern tightly, its light flickering as if it, too, was succumbing to the suffocating darkness. "Johann, the symbols," I gasped. He stared at me, uncomprehending, until I pointed to the etched designs on the lantern's glass. They seemed to pulse faintly, reacting to the hymn. "There's something about the lantern," I stammered. "It's not just light. It's..." Before I could finish, the woman lunged toward us, her movements impossibly fast. Johann swung the torch, but she batted it aside with a snarl. Her hand closed around my wrist, and I felt a searing cold that seemed to pierce my very soul. "You will join the choir," she hissed, her voice like shattered glass. Desperation surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I swung the lantern. The glass shattered against her staff, and a burst of brilliant light erupted from the fragments. The woman screamed, a sound so unearthly it felt like it would split the world apart. The light spread, consuming the darkness, and the figures began to dissolve, their forms unraveling like smoke in the wind. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the bell tolled once more, a single, mournful note that reverberated through the chapel. The woman staggered back, her body flickering like a dying flame. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice echoing faintly. And then she was gone, along with the children and the ghostly choir. When the woman vanished, the chapel fell into a profound silence, as though the world itself had paused to catch its breath. Johann and I stood motionless, surrounded by the splintered remains of the altar and the faint glow of dying embers from the broken lantern. The oppressive cold had lifted, yet the air retained a peculiar stillness that felt no less unsettling. Johann crouched to examine the shattered lantern, his hands trembling. The strange symbols etched into the fragments had ceased to glow, leaving only ordinary shards of glass. "We're alive," he muttered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "But for how long?" I turned my gaze to the altar, or rather, to the chasm it had revealed. The gap was no longer bottomless. Instead, it revealed a staircase hewn from ancient stone, descending into the mountain's core. From below, faint whispers reached us, not of children singing, but of wind weaving through unseen caverns. I didn't want to follow it, but something compelled me to move closer. Johann gripped my shoulder. "You're not thinking of going down there, are you?" "We have to," I replied. "If we leave without understanding what happened, the next group to stumble across this place will suffer the same fate, or worse." He hesitated, then nodded grimly. Together, we descended, each step drawing us deeper into the mountain's frozen heart. The air grew warmer as we descended, a strange contrast to the icy world above. The staircase ended abruptly in a cavern, lit faintly by an unnatural glow emanating from the walls themselves. At the center stood a massive stone circle, engraved with runes that matched the ones on the lantern. Surrounding the circle were relics, torn ribbons, broken hymnals, and what I recognized as the remnants of Christmas decorations from decades past. And there, at the heart of the circle, lay the bones of the children. I staggered back, choking on the realization. Johann knelt beside the remains, his face pale. "This is where they were trapped," he said, his voice barely audible. "And where they return each year." The runes on the stone began to pulse, faint at first, then brighter, as if the room were responding to our presence. A faint hum filled the air, and I could hear it again, the song. "They're coming back," Johann whispered. Desperation surged through me. I looked around the cavern, searching for anything that might stop the cycle, anything that might give these souls peace. My eyes fell on a small, rusted bell lying among the relics. It was unassuming, yet it seemed to vibrate faintly in my hand when I picked it up. "What if this was theirs?" I said. "What if it's tied to their fate?" Johann looked doubtful, but didn't argue. As the hymn grew louder, the bones in the circle began to shift, rising as if animated by unseen hands. The spectral figures of the children began to reappear, their faces devoid of malice, but full of longing. I raised the bell and rang it with all my might. The sound was piercing, cutting through the hymn like a blade. The children paused, their forms wavering. "Go home," I said, my voice firm despite the terror coursing through me. "You don't have to sing anymore. You don't have to stay here." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the children began to dissolve, their forms unraveling like mist. The bones collapsed into stillness, and the cavern grew silent once more. When the last child vanished, the glow from the walls faded, leaving us in near darkness. Johann lit a match, his hand shaking, and we climbed back up the staircase, leaving the cavern and its horrors behind. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Bavarian mountains, casting a soft, golden light over the snow. The chapel loomed silently behind us, its secrets buried for another year. As we trudged back toward the village, I turned to Johann. "Do you think it's over?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "We stopped the song, for now. But some things don't stay quiet forever." The village bells began to ring, marking the start of Christmas morning. Their chimes were pure, unmarred by the haunting melody that had plagued us. Yet as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep within the mountain, the choir was still waiting. And perhaps, one day, they would sing again,